Hello, welcome back to the channel, everyone. It's Mace coming to you from beautiful Western Canada, beautiful British Columbia, and today's video, Germany's election results explained. There's been a lot of talk about how Germany's political landscape has been changing and reacting, and especially in the last year or so. Let's hop right into it and check it out. And kind of like, around the world, especially since Trump came into office, not just the first time, but the second time, just the resurgence of populism, populist candidates, and, a swing to the right, I would say. Overall, let's hop into it.
This video is brought to you by Ground News. On Sunday, Germans went to vote in the 2025 federal election, with a massive turnout of 84%, the highest since 1980.
84%, that's incredibly impressive. I think Canada's like, if I had to guess, somewhere in the 50th percentile, maybe 60 for our turnouts, so that's incredible.
87. It was clearly won by the centre-right Christian Democrats, with the Alternative for Deutschland coming second and doubling their vote share compared to 2021. Meanwhile, it was a disappointing night for Germany's incumbent parties. The centre-left Social Democratic Party, the Greens and the neoliberal Free Democratic Party all lost vote share, and the FDP and left conservative PSW failed to make it into Parliament. So, in this video, we'll look
failed to make it into Parliament, and the AfD continues to do well.
At Germany's election results, some recent political context, and what might happen next. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and election was narrowly won by Germany's centre-left Social Democratic Party, or SPD, led by Olaf Scholz, previously Merkel's vice-chancellor and finance minister, closely followed by the centre-right CDU-CSU party. The Greens came third, the Free Democratic Party, or FDP, fourth, and the AfD fifth. As a result, Scholz's SPD formed a coalition with the Greens and the FDP, known as the Traffic Light Coalition, because of their colours. The government started out on a strong footing.
The Traffic Light Coalition, I like that.
With the SPD's vote share of 25.7% being their best result since 2005. And according to a pre-election Infratest DIMAP poll, a majority of Germans, 51%, expected Scholz to be a good chancellor. Unfortunately, things didn't go to plan for the Traffic Light Coalition. Scholz's term coincided with a very unstable geopolitical environment, and his government's response to events like the Ukraine war, the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines, and the Israel-Hamas war, as well as domestic issues like the economy, energy, and soaring crime rates, failed to convince voters. Arguably, the most difficult issue for the coalition has been energy. In February 2022, just 2.5 months into Scholz's term, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, sparking an energy and inflationary crisis in Europe that hit the German economy particularly hard, given its dependence on Russian oil and gas. The subsequent rise in energy prices both undermined German consumer confidence, but also the international competitiveness of German industry, which has been the backbone of Germany's export-led economy.
I think it's difficult to be so reliant on Russian oil, considering that country's leader.
Since the turn of the millennium. Rising energy prices interacted in uncomfortable ways with the coalition's green ambitions. In 2023, for instance, voters revolted against Scholz's attempt to ban the installation of new gas boilers. And at least some voters were unhappy with Scholz's decision to stick with Merkel's nuclear power phase-out in the context of sky-high energy prices. Fueled by anxieties about green policies and immigration, the AfD surged in the polls and have polled ahead of all three coalition parties since mid-2023, while the Christian Democrats have been way...
So it seems to me like the way it's trending, you'll have the AfD, maybe in the next election, but depending on how the political climate shifts, they've been capitalizing, of course, on all of the fears that the public has. And they'll probably continue to do so because things don't really seem to be they're not really trending in the opposite direction that they've been, so.
Ahead of the SPD since mid-2022. This has all been exacerbated by constant infighting between the FDP, who refused to countenance significant increases in borrowing, and the SPD and the Greens, who wanted further borrowing to fund an effective response to all the various crises afflicting Germany at the moment. This culminated in Scholz firing FDP Finance Minister Christian Lindner, and in November effectively imploding the coalition. Scholz then called a vote of confidence in his SPD Green minority government, which he lost, thus deciding to call an early election in February 2025. Now, this brings us to Sunday.
Wow.
Going into the election, the opinion polls had the CDU on about 30%, the AFD on about 20%, the SPD on 15%, the Greens on 12%, the Left on 7%, and both the BSW and the FDP just under 5%, which is the threshold for representation in the German parliament. This meant that a lot would depend on whether or not these two parties made it to the 5% threshold, as if they didn't, the CDU and the SPD would probably be able to form a two-party grand coalition. But if they did, they'd probably win enough seats to force the CDU and SPD to find a third coalition partner. In the end, the polls were broadly correct. The CDU finished first with 28.5% of the vote, a roughly 4 percentage point increase from their 2021 results, meaning its leader, Friedrich Merz, will likely be Germany's next chancellor. Next up in second were the AFD with 20.8%, and while this was a few points less than some pre-election polls had been predicting, it was still the party's highest ever result, and double what they got in 2021. There was also a stark regional divide here, with the AFD winning the most second votes, i.e. party list votes, in most constituencies in the east, apart from Berlin, neighbouring Potsdam and Leipzig, and the CDU winning most in the west. Support for the AFD was also higher among voters with a basic education, who were twice as likely to vote for the AFD as those with a higher education. Moving on, the SPD came third with 16.4%, their worst result at a federal election since 1887. Scholz took responsibility for this, calling it a bitter result and a defeat, but also took aim at the AFD and said, "We live in a democratic country and we're fighting for democracy. That an extreme right party like the AFD can get results like this in Germany is not something we can just forget about."
Yeah, we live in a democratic country, and we are fighting for democracy. Then an extreme right-wing party like the AFD can get results like this in Germany is not something we can just forget about. Well, he's right. He's certainly right. You can't forget about it. You have to be, there certainly seemed to be a political force developing as a party in Germany, and they're saying things that people can connect with. Obviously, a lot of fears right now about, like I said earlier in the video, immigration, crime rates, the economy, just so many things. The looming Russia Ukraine conflict, the Israel-Hamas war, the list goes on and on. All of the things that can be brought up and used to stoke and attract people to the parties. Interesting stuff.
Scholz will continue as acting chancellor until after a new government's formed, although he's still saying he wants the role of chancellor in government, so we'll have to see what happens here. Next were the German Greens with 11.6%, a few points lower than 2021. Greens leader Robert Habeck said they wanted more, but also said that the Greens haven't collapsed like the other coalition parties, the SPD and the FDP. However, Habeck also suggested that Merz was responsible for the Greens' poor result, saying Merz had boosted the extremes, criticising Merz's decision earlier this year to seek support on a hardline immigration bill from the AFD. Die Linke came fifth with 8.8%, a very good result for the Socialist Left Party that was polling below 5% only a couple of weeks ago. Die Linke also came first with first-time voters and with 18 to 24-year-olds, followed in both cases by the AFD. Lastly, the neoliberal FDP and conservative left BSW missed out on parliamentary seats.
I'm curious which party I would lean towards if I was in Germany. Guys, what do you think?
Winning 4.3% and 4.97% respectively. So what happens next? Well, luckily for Merz, because both the FDP and BSW fell below the 5% threshold, the CDU and the SPD now have a majority of seats between them, and so will probably form a two-party grand coalition. This is, in many ways, the best conceivable result for Merz. As the past few years have demonstrated, a three-party coalition, which would have had...
I would say I'm typically liberal when it comes to social issues. But certainly more conservative economically. But you got to have that nice balance and mix, which is tough right now. There's a lot of discontent and not a lot of options all the time, right, to vote for, with corrupt politicians, corrupt governments. So
had to be formed if another small party had won seats is difficult to manage, and the SPD's poor result means they'll be very much the junior partner in the new government. As a final thing, it's worth stressing that while a return to grand coalition politics might feel like a return to normal in some sense, German politics is more fractured than it's ever been. The CDU and SPD achieved their low...
Yeah, that's, I don't think, certainly unique to Germany, this fractured political state. It seems to me most countries, a lot of countries around the world, have extreme political polarization right now. And, the pendulum swings, but that pendulum is also slicing right down the middle. And you have kind of like the extremes on each side, and then you have people sprinkled more and more and more into the middle. But those extreme polarized folks, it's tough. It's tough to find something to unite people.
Lowest collective vote share ever. So perhaps the main question is whether they can actually stabilise German politics. Many other European countries have resorted to grand coalition politics to keep anti-establishment parties like the AfD out of government, but with mixed results. Excluding the AfD from government risks burnishing their anti-establishment credentials, and elections across the world suggest that parties benefit more from being in opposition. There's a lot happening in German politics right now, and actually consuming news is pretty difficult in the current landscape. We're increasingly being flooded by misleading content, algorithmic feeds that just back up our biases, and reductions in fact-checking efforts. It almost feels like people are in...
I saw a cousin of mine speaking about how he's deleting most of his social media accounts because he's finding that face-to-face, natural community interactions are becoming less and less in his community, and is worried about that, and how these threads of interactions that you have every day, threads of interactions in a community that are face-to-face, all of these micro interactions, they all come together, and they actually are the fabric of a community, of a society, and they're being eroded, like these interactions, by these companies, these social media things, these social media sites, which, they feign that they're keeping us more interconnected, but at the end of the day, they're actually creating more disconnect.
Intentionally making it harder to get to the truth. One way you can cut through the noise is with Ground News, a website and app on a mission to give readers...
So that's the end of the video. Interesting stuff, Germany, the US, Canada, France, like so many countries around the world are going through political transformations, and it's an interesting, difficult political landscape. Right now we're dealing with Trump and all his bluster about annexing Canada, and Canada's going to become the 51st state, and how come we're subsidizing them to $200 billion and and all I can say, I'm not an expert in all of the numbers. All I can say is we will never be Americans. So, and we don't want to be Americans. I feel like the U.S. political leaders can be somewhat delusional sometimes in their view that everybody wants to be a part of the U.S. When you see the polarization and the politics that's happening there, and you have politicians just flippantly talking about annexing Canada, and the imperialist attitudes. All right. See y'all next time. Tschüss.